I'm Audrey Esarey, and today I'm going to talk to you about paper piecing. I love paper piecing because I get a very precise and accurate result with my quilts. When I design a quilt, I can see exactly what it's going to look like once I apply the fabric because I'll be using paper templates to sew. That's why it's called foundation paper piecing, because I can use the paper as a foundation to make sure that my stitching is exactly where I want it to be. Let's take a brief look at some of the quilts that I've used with paper piecing. This top quilt, Indigo Radial, is the pattern that we'll be making today. We're going to use this paper pieced arc of pieced wedges, except we're going to be doing it using a colorful gradation. When I start using the colorful gradation, I lay out my pieces in order so that I make sure that I'm piecing in the correct order of the colors. This is so I can sit down at my machine and then not get mixed up about which piece comes next. Let's briefly look at the tools that I use to paper piece. I have my cutting mat and my rotary cutter, and then I also use my finger presser, and I use this special ruler that adds a 1/4 inch to my seam allowance, so I can quickly trim my pieces to be the right size while I'm paper piecing. This glove that I use is an anti-cut glove, so if I'm ever cutting without a ruler, it helps protect my non-cutting hand. And then of course I have my sewing machine. I'm going to be reducing my stitch length to 1.5, and that perforates the paper so that it's easier to tear out later. Let's look at one of the paper piecing templates. These are the templates that I sew for the arcs. You can see that it mirrors what I've got in my sample quilt. What I do with my templates is I'll take a pencil and write the color that I'll be putting in each piece with a pencil, just so I don't lose track of what color I'm using as I piece the arc. This makes it seamless and easy for me to sit down at my machine and do sewing without worrying about where I am in the arc or what my next color is. So I have an arc that is partially sewn here, and I've got the next colors that are coming. So why don't we sew on some next pieces? So this is my partially complete paper pieced arc, and I have the next fabric, which is this mustard yellow. I can see that if I look at my template, it's yellow number 3, so I know that I'm picking the next color correctly. I'm going to take my piece of fabric and layer it. And something that you can do is line it up right with the prior piece, but if you scooch it over just a little bit, then when you press it at a later step, you won't get any seam shadow. You can pin at this stage to make sure that this piece of fabric stays, but really, I'm pretty comfortable taking it back to my machine and sewing on this line without pinning that. I can see my fabric, this is the new piece, peeking out just a little bit here, and that's fine. So let's go to the machine and sew that seam. One thing that's important is this dashed line here. That is my seam allowance line. That is where I'm going to trim eventually, and so I want to backstitch over the start and over the finish of this line, because then when I trim, the stitches are secure and I won't have the pieces start to come apart as I do my curved seam later. I'm gonna lower my presser foot, and you can see that my needle is right at the seam allowance start. I'm going to sew a little bit and then backstitch, and then continue to sew right on the printed line on the template, and then I'm going to backstitch at the end. I'm going to make the machine go just a little bit faster, so that was pretty slow. And you can see I'm staying right on the solid line. And as I get to the end of the seam, I'm going to remember to backstitch over the seam allowance and then cut my thread. So you can see this is the line that I just stitched, and here we've got the piece attached. Open this up. And just a friendly reminder, I used a paper piecing thread for this stitch. And this thread specifically is polyester, and I think that it provides additional strength for when you tear out the paper later in the process. So just with my finger presser, I've got a nice flat seam. The next thing that I want to do is flip this over and identify my next sewing line. I'm going to use my add a quarter ruler and crease that line just with my fingernail and fold this over. I've got this ruler that adds a 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going to take my rotary cutter and line it right up against here and trim away the excess. This prepares my piece for the next piece of fabric. I'm going to grab the next piece of fabric and layer it over, remembering to give myself just a little bit extra so I don't have any seam shadows come through. And I'm going to take this back to the machine. We're going to repeat these steps again. I'm going to lower my needle, do a back stitch, sew that seam with the paper piecing thread, and cut my thread. Again, I'm going to use my finger presser and get that nice and flat. Some quilters will use a seam roller. Some quilters will use a mini iron or just press. But I prefer to use a finger presser because then I can work just to the side of my sewing machine. I don't have to be walking back and forth to the iron. Once this step is complete, you'll have a template that looks like this. So it's got all of my color gradation pieced in, paper pieced in, but you can see that I have still the seam allowance that needs to be trimmed. And so something that I'll do is put on my cut resistant glove, and let's trim around this. So I'm going to trim right on the dotted line, which is my seam allowance line, my rotary cutter, and just very carefully start to trim my template. Okay. And once I trim each side, and then I would use a ruler for this side, my final template is going to look like this. The next step would be to tear out the paper, and so I'm just going to show you briefly how I do that. I'm going to bend the paper back and crease and rip that away. And so I would do that for this entire arc. Once this arc is complete, you can see how it would integrate into the design, and it would actually look pretty nice in this quilt that I have right here. So you can see that there are many different ways to apply paper piecing. Here's the indigo radial pattern where these templates come from. But then you can also use paper piecing in this design, and you can integrate a gradation in. And then lastly, you can get very small pieces paper piecing. And as you can see, I get a very accurate result. So the accuracy and precision is why I prefer paper piecing, and I hope this inspires you to give paper piecing a try.